Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking an intense deep dive into the American Revolution.
And we really mean the entire revolution.
Exactly. We're looking beyond the fireworks and the famous paintings. This is going to be a thorough examination of a political and social order that, well, it completely broke down and was replaced. We're covering the full scope from those first policy clashes in 1765 right through the ultimate establishment of the Constitution in 1783 and really beyond that.
And our mission for you, the curious learner, is to move past that simple narrative we all get in school. You know, the righteous war against a tyrannical king.
Right.
The sources show us this was a far more complex conflict, riddled with internal contradictions. It was a clash of ideology, a desperate financial scramble, and a military campaign whose outcome was, genuinely uncertain until the very end.
So what we're aiming to do here is extract those surprising facts, those key nuggets of knowledge that reveal the sheer radical nature of this transformation.
And the contradictions. You can't forget the contradictions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the eventual outcome is, and I don't think this is an overstatement, arguably the single most influential political event of the last 300 years.
It's hard to argue with that.
Despite years of chaos, massive debt, and uncertain military fortunes, this conflict culminated in the formation of the world's first federal republic. And it was founded entirely on the idea of the consent of the governed.
A concept that didn't just challenge but fundamentally reversed centuries, millennia even, of the global tradition of inherited authority. It's a total flip of the script.
So to understand why the colonies just exploded after 1765, you have to first understand the century of calm that came before it.
And the key concept here is salutary neglect. It sounds a bit odd, but it's crucial.
What was it exactly?
Following the turmoil of Britain's own glorious revolution in 1688, Great Britain essentially adopted an unofficial policy, a hands-off policy of governance regarding its American colonies.
And it sounds so benign, doesn't it? Salutary neglect. But it was this beautiful accident, really, that allowed colonial self-governance to just flourish.
It really did. They weren't just running local town hall.
No, not at all. They were developing highly sophisticated, semi-independent political and legal structures. You look at William Penn's frame of government in Pennsylvania, for example.
Right. And they nurtured this robust, decentralized democratic culture. You see it especially in New England, where the congregational churches, they basically acted as local political debating clubs.
So this tradition of deep local control, it becomes absolutely ingrained in the colonial psyche.
It leads to this powerful shared belief that they possessed not just the competence, but the right to manage their own affairs.
There's a great quote that sums this up.
Captain Levi Preston.
Yes, from Danvers, Massachusetts. He was a patriot, and when someone asked him years later why he fought, he didn't mention taxes or King George III.
None of the things we think of.
He just said, we always had governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should.
And that, right there, is the patriot position in a nutshell. It wasn't about creating a new right. It was about defending an existing right to autonomy they felt they'd had for a century.
But this tradition of self-rule, it just smashes head-on into the brutal fiscal reality of the 7 Years' War, which wrapped up in 1763.
A war which Britain won decisively. They claimed an enormous new empire in North America. 3 million square miles of land. It's a staggering amount.
But that victory was financially catastrophic.
Utterly. The war had nearly broken the Bank of England. The national debt had ballooned to an unprecedented $133 million.
To put that into perspective for you, the annual budget for the entire British government was around $8 million.
And they were already spending $5 million of that every year just on debt servicing, just paying the interest. They were desperate for revenue.
So they're financial planners, they look across the Atlantic, they see these new territories that require defense and administration.
And the Grenville Ministry decides to permanently garrison 10,000 soldiers in North America.
Now, why so many?
Well, the justification was that they were needed to manage any remaining French interests, deal with, foreign populations, and crucially, prevent constant costly conflicts with indigenous groups on the frontier.
And that permanent military presence alone was going to cost Britain another £360,000 annually, a huge sum.
So when Grenville and Parliament look at the colonies, they see a wealthy, very lightly taxed population that, in their view, should contribute.
And the numbers seem to back them up, Ray.
The numbers were undeniable. A subject living in England paid, on average, 26 shillings a year in taxes to the crown.
And in the American colonies.
Barely 1 shilling per capita.
Right.
And that includes the enslaved population in the count. So to the British, it was just a matter of fairness and solvency.
But the immediate trigger, the very first irritant that comes even before the taxes, was territorial. It was the Royal Proclamation of 1763.
Right. This decree stated that all the new land west of the Appalachian Mountains, all the way to the Mississippi River, was now designated as an Indian reserve.
Meaning it was closed off to colonial settlement?
Completely closed off. And this was a deeply unpopular move on multiple fronts.
Of course.
While it was intended to minimize these costly conflicts with tribes like the Iroquois in the Ohio Valley, it directly enraged the colonists who felt they had fought the war for that land.
And it wasn't just small-time settlers, was it?
No, and this is critical. It alienated powerful colonial land speculators, men who would become future revolutionary leaders, including George Washington himself.
Washington had invested heavily in Western land claim.
Heavily. So they saw the proclamation as this arbitrary top-down limit on their economic future, an attack on their ability to create wealth.
So, okay, we have the territorial anger. Now we move to the revenue generation. In 1764, we get the Sugar Act.
Now, this is often misremembered. People think it was a big tax hike.
It wasn't.
It actually decreased the existing customs duties on molasses. But the real issue, the core issue, was enforcement.
They were actually going to collect the tax this time.
Exactly. It dramatically increased the rigor of customs collection, prosecuting smugglers, tightening control over colonial ports. It effectively ended the colony's long-standing ability to just evade taxation.
But the true constitutional flashpoint, the one that really lit the fuse, was the Stamp Act of 1765.
This was the big one, because it was the first time Parliament imposed a direct internal tax on the colonies, not just an external duty on trade.
Explain that distinction. What's an internal tax?
It meant they mandated that stamps, which you had to buy, be placed on every official document. Newspapers, pamphlets, licenses, even decks of playing cards. It was a tax on internal colonial commerce.
And this is where the historical analysis really deepens. We hear about the taxes being oppressive, but as historians point out, the actual cost was objectively tiny.
It was. Lord North later on calculated that an average Englishman paid 25 shillings a year to the crown, while the average American paid just 6 pence.
So if the cost was so low, why did it ignite such a firestorm?
Because it was about principle, not pence. The objection was purely constitutional.
The idea of being taxed by a body where you have no representation.
Precisely. They saw this direct internal tax as setting a dangerous precedent that would inevitably lead to Parliament just draining colonial wealth without any accountability whatsoever. It crystallized the rallying cry, no taxation without representation.
And the colonial response was immediate, and it was unprecedented in its coordination.
It was. The Sons of Liberty formed, using public protests, economic boycotts, and, let's be clear, organized violence.
Yeah, this wasn't just polite debate. They looted the homes of officials like Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson in Boston.
Which illustrates that this was not just a political debate. It was a visceral social movement with a real threat of violence behind it.
And on the political front,
9 colonies sent delegates to the Stamp Act Congress. They issued the formal Declaration of Rights and Grievances.
and this was a pivotal moment because it moved the resistance from disorganized mob action to a coordinated continental political statement.
Absolutely. Yeah. They asserted that as British subjects, they were entitled to the very same rights as those living in Britain, and specifically that taxation without consent was unlawful.
So how did Parliament react to this?
Well, they fired back. They asserted their supreme authority over the entire empire, insisting that the colonists were legally just subordinate corporations.
And they famously countered the representation argument with the concept of virtual representation.
Right, and this is a crucial concept to understand the conflict, because it sounds so flimsy to us today.
What was it? What was virtual representation?
Parliament argued that unlike actual representation where you vote for a specific person representing your town or county, Parliament members represented the interests of all British subjects everywhere.
Even those who couldn't vote.
Even them, like women, non-landowners, and of course colonial subjects. The argument was that their interests were virtually represented in London.
But the colonists had been enjoying actual representation in their local assemblies for a century. They found this argument completely hollow.
Of course they did. It was absurd on its face to them.
Ultimately, though, the economic pressure worked. British merchants who were getting hammered by the colonial boycotts lobbied Parliament hard.
They did, and Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, which prompted massive celebrations in the colonies. But, and this is the critical political move, They immediately passed the Declaratory Act.
So they give with one hand and take with the other.
Exactly. The Declaratory Act was Parliament drawing a definitive line in the sand. It was a statement of intent and principle. It explicitly asserted Parliament's full power and authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever.
So the repeal of the Stamp Act wasn't a change of policy. It was just a temporary tactical retreat.
That's the perfect way to put it. It guaranteed future conflict because the fundamental constitutional principle remained completely unresolved.
And that conflict arrived swiftly. The Townshend Acts in 1767.
These acts imposed external duties on imported goods like tea, glass, and paper. And Parliament's goal here wasn't solely about the money.
It was about authority.
It was a deliberate attempt to assert the legislative authority they had just declared in the Declaratory Act, to prove they could do it.
And this is where we see the colonial political thought rapidly maturing and getting more sophisticated.
Yes, with John Dickinson's hugely popular Problems, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania.
He argued brilliantly against the Townshend duties. He actually conceded that Parliament had the authority to regulate trade for the good of the empire.
Right, but he argued these duties were unconstitutional because their primary stated goal was to raise revenue, not just regulate commerce.
That distinction, revenue versus regulation, it became the new intellectual battleground.
It did, and the tension boiled over most violently in Massachusetts, as it so often did. The Boston Massacre occurred on March 5, 1770.
British troops fired into a crowd that was, to be fair, actively threatening them.
The very hostile crowd, yes. They killed 5 people, including Crispus Attucks. And although the soldiers were actually defended in court by the patriot John Adams and acquitted,
The incident was immediately seized upon by agitators like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere,
who used it as potent propaganda, accelerating that downward spiral toward military conflict.
So, to try and ease tensions, Lord North's new ministry repealed most of the Townshend duties in 1770.
But they kept one. They kept the tax on tea, just to maintain the symbolic principle of Parliament's right to tax.
And that bought them 3 years of relative calm. But the principle, that ticking time bomb, remained lethal.
And it was revived in 1773 when Parliament passed the Tea Act.
This is where the policy just backfires spectacularly.
It really does. The Tea Act was intended to help the struggling British East India Company. It allowed them to sell tea directly to the colonies at a very, very low price.
And critically, even with the tax included, this British tea was now cheaper than the smuggled, untaxed Dutch tea that American merchants had been dealing in.
Which created this multi-layered opposition. It angered the ideological tax resistors, who saw the low price as a deliberate bribe, a trick to get them to accept the detested principle of taxation.
But it also infuriated the powerful American smugglers and merchants, people like John Hancock.
Absolutely. They saw their highly profitable business of dealing in contraband Dutch tea get immediately undercut by Parliament's policy. It hit them right in the wallet.
So you have this fusion of economic interest and political principle, and that leads directly to the iconic Act of Defiance on December 16, 1773.
The Boston Tea Party. Samuel Adams led men, dressed to evoke indigenous people, onto the company ships and dumped 10,000 pounds worth of tea into Boston Harbor.
The response from Britain was swift, furious, and purely punitive.
The 4 Intolerable Acts of 1774, which the colonists immediately labeled the Coercive Acts, they were designed to crush Massachusetts entirely.
What did they do?
First, the Boston Port Act closed the vital harbor until the tea was paid for. Second, the Massachusetts Government Act essentially abolished self-governance by severely restricting town meetings.
And the other two.
The Administration of Justice Act moved the trials of British officials to Britain, which effectively guaranteed they'd be acquitted. And the Quartering Act required royal governors to house troops in private homes.
This was effectively a declaration of war against one colony.
The sources confirm this was the point of no return. Massachusetts patriots immediately created an alternative shadow government, the Provincial Congress, and began coordinating militias for military preparation.
And this resistance was possible because the underlying infrastructure had been perfected over the last decade.
The Committees of Correspondence. An estimated 7,000 to 8,000 dedicated patriots were involved, providing the framework for a rebel government, enforcing boycotts, and spreading information across vast distances.
And the response from the other colonies was unified solidarity.
It was. In September 1774, 12 colonies convened the First Continental Congress. They established the Continental Association, which was a non-importation and non-consumption agreement,
Essentially, a total economic boycott of Britain.
enforced by those committees of correspondence.
It's essential to note, though, that the commitment to revolution was not universal, even at this late date.
No, conservative voices were still present. Joseph Galloway, a Pennsylvania delegate, he presented a proposal for a colonial parliament, a moderate compromise.
Which would have kept the colonies within the empire, but guaranteed their political rights.
Exactly. But it failed. And the failure of the Galloway Plan signaled that the intent of the majority had hardened irreversibly toward a full confrontation.
Which arrived quickly. King George III declared Massachusetts in rebellion in February 1775.
And he gave orders to seize rebel weapons stockpiles and arrest the leaders of the Provincial Congress.
Which culminated in the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, the spark that set the war alight.
The immediate result.
Yeah.
15,000 armed patriots laying siege to 6,500 British troops who were now trapped in Boston.
So despite the outbreak of open war, the political body leading the resistance, the Second Continental Congress, was still profoundly divided when it convened in Philadelphia.
Very divided. On the one hand, they authorized the creation of the Continental Army and unanimously appointed George Washington, a respected Virginian with military experience, as commander-in-chief.
A move which lent intercolonial legitimacy to what was, at that point, mostly a northern conflict.
Right. But at the same time, they were still reaching for reconciliation. They sent the Olive Branch petition to King George, a final last-ditch effort for accord.
And in it, they insisted they only desired peace and a redress of grievances.
But the king rejected it outright. He issued a proclamation of rebellion, effectively declaring all 13 states in rebellion and their representatives in Congress as traitors liable to be hanged.
The moment for compromise had passed.
It was over.
And the harsh reality of the conflict was quickly established at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775.
Though the British eventually took the hill, it was a bloody Pyrrhic victory. The British suffered 1,000 casualties compared to 500 American losses.
It proved the Americans would fight with deadly determination, and it proved the human cost would be immense for Britain.
And it's here we have to revisit Benjamin Franklin's chillingly pragmatic view of the war, which really highlights the strategic nightmare Britain was facing.
What did he say?
In a letter in October 1775, he sarcastically tallied the costs. He wrote, "Britain, at the expense of 3 millions, has killed 150 Yankees this campaign.
Okay.
During the same time, 60,000 children have been born in America."
That is a staggering calculation. It's not just a quote. It's a cold, hard, analytical snapshot of the demographic impossibility of Britain ever winning a long-term war of attrition.
Exactly. For every casualty they inflicted, the American population, which was doubling every 25 years, produced hundreds of new potential recruits. Time was always on the American side, provided they could just survive the initial military onslaught.
And survive they did. By March 1776, Washington used captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to fortify Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston,
which forced the British to evacuate the city by sea. And for a brief period, the revolutionaries were in physical control of all 13 colonies, having driven out royal officials and courts.
This required a simultaneous political revolution at the state level. In each former colony, patriots established new governments, conventions, and legislatures operating entirely outside of British legal parameters.
And new state constitutions were rapidly drawn up to replace the old royal charters. They immediately proclaimed themselves sovereign states.
So Congress, in May 1776, formally voted to suppress all forms of crown authority and replace them with locally created governing bodies.
Right, and the state constitutions that followed really reflect this deep internal philosophical tension among the founders about how much democracy was actually safe for a new republic.
It wasn't a unified vision at all.
Not even close. If you look at the conservative constitutions, places like Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, they featured robust checks on popular power.
Things like high property qualifications for voting.
Yes, and even higher qualifications for holding office. They had strong governors with veto power and bicameral legislatures designed explicitly to check the sudden whims of the popular lower house.
So they wanted a republic led by gentlemen, rooted in stable property ownership.
Exactly. But then you have the radical side, led by Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New Hampshire. Their constitutions were genuinely revolutionary.
How so?
They favored universal manhood suffrage. or very minimal property requirements. They had weak governors, often just a council, and sometimes even unicameral legislatures.
Yeah.
They embodied the true egalitarian spirit of the revolution, focused on popular will.
And this difference, this push-pull between radical democracy and conservative stability, leads directly to John Adams' famous 1776 warning.
A warning which reveals the profound anxiety among the elite.
He worried that extending the franchise too widely would inevitably lead to demands from women, from lads, meaning young men aged 12 to 21, and the propertyless.
And he feared that this would ultimately confound and destroy all distinctions and prostrate all ranks to one common level.
That quote is so critical. It tells you what the conservatives were truly afraid of. It wasn't just British tyranny, it was social leveling.
They feared the revolution would erase the existing social hierarchy based on wealth, education, and status. It underscores that the revolution was as much a civil war over the future shape of American society as it was a war for independence.
Despite these internal debates on how democratic the new states should be, the movement toward full national separation became inevitable.
North Carolina's Halifax Resolves and then Virginia's Richard Henry Lee's motion on June 7th spurred Congress into action.
Which led to the Declaration of Independence, drafted predominantly by Thomas Jefferson and unanimously adopted on July 4th, 1776.
And this document was the ideological cornerstone. It explicitly rejected monarchy and aristocracy and proclaimed a new government based on the Enlightenment philosophies of liberalism and republicanism.
All encapsulated in that foundational revolutionary claim that all men are created equal.
Now acting as independent and sovereign states, they faced the immediate practical problem of how to fight a coordinated war.
Which led to the Articles of Confederation.
Exactly. The Second Continental Congress began deliberating them. They were approved in 1777 and fully ratified in March 1781.
And what were they exactly?
They created a weak, multi-state coordinating body focused purely on diplomacy, war prosecution, and common defense. It served as the first governing structure for the United States and Congress assembled. Very limited power.
So when the British returned to America in force in the summer of 1776, their strategy was based on a massive, almost fatal miscalculation.
It really was. The British historian Jeremy Black's analysis is vital here. The British High Command seriously misunderstood the depth and breadth of support for the Patriots.
They just didn't get it.
They viewed the resistance not as a unified political movement, but as a large-scale riot by a few miscreants who would just scatter once a truly professional army showed up.
That assumption was crushed on the field, though not immediately. After forcing the British out of Boston, Washington moved his entire army to New York.
And the British returned in July 1776, amassing the largest fleet and invasion force seen up to that point. In August, they handed Washington a crushing defeat at the Battle of Brooklyn.
The single largest battle of the entire war.
It was. And they nearly captured Washington and his entire army, which had to execute this stealthy, desperate night evacuation across the river to survive.
Following that near disaster, the British attempted a diplomatic solution, but it was backed by overwhelming force.
The Staten Island Peace Conference, held in September 1776. Admiral Howe demanded that the American delegation, led by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, formally retract the Declaration of Independence.
Wait, a retraction after all the bloodshed? Did they truly believe that was possible?
It speaks to their underlying contempt for the colonial political system. They just didn't see it as legitimate.
So, of course, Adams and Franklin refused.
They did. They stated they would only negotiate on the basis of recognition of American sovereignty. Negotiations collapsed, and the British promptly seized New York City, turning it into their political and military headquarters for the rest of the war.
Washington was pushed deep into Pennsylvania, and the situation was desperate. His enlistments were running out.
It was bleak. The critical, iconic turnaround came with Washington's bold, almost impossible decision to cross the icy Delaware River in a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton on Christmas night, 1776.
And that was followed by another victory at Princeton.
These were not massive strategic victories in terms of numbers, but their psychological impact was immeasurable.
It was everything.
It boosted flagging Patriot morale, secured vital supplies, and crucially convinced enlistees to sign up again. It prevented the collapse of the Continental Army just when the British thought they had won the war.
And he regained control of most of New Jersey.
He did.
But the truly geopolitical turning point came in 1777 at Saratoga.
Yes. The British planned this grand strategy. General Burgoyne would lead an invasion force south from Canada down the Hudson River.
aiming to link up with the main British Army in New York City.
And the goal was to isolate and cut off New England, which they rightly saw as the heart of the rebellion.
But here is the critical strategic blunder that historian Joseph Ellis emphasizes. General William Howe, the commander of the main British force, he had simultaneously decided to go capture Philadelphia instead.
He just went off on his own mission. The lack of coordination was absolutely disastrous for them.
So Burgoyne was left isolated and surrounded by converging American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold.
And after the battles of Saratoga in October 1777, Burgoyne's entire invasion force was forced to surrender, the first time a full British army had ever surrendered in a foreign field.
That surrender was the tangible proof France needed.
It was. Benjamin Franklin, acting as the U.S. envoy in Paris, he secured his diplomatic masterpiece. Saratoga convinced France to formally enter the war in 1778.
They signed a permanent treaty of alliance that officially recognized the United States as an independent nation.
And this instantly transformed the conflict from a colonial rebellion into a global war. The British were suddenly fighting an intercontinental conflict without any major European allies.
Spain joined France in 1779.
Followed by the Dutch in 1780. This forced Britain to fight on multiple fronts, in Europe, the Caribbean, India, and contend with a combined Atlantic naval blockade.
As a result, Britain began to view America as only one of many fronts.
Right. They shifted significant focus and naval resources to defending their lucrative Caribbean sugar colonies.
And in America, this led to a practical stalemate in the North. Sir Henry Clinton, the new British commander, evacuated Philadelphia and returned to New York City.
The Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in 1778 was the last major battle fought in the North. The British had shifted their gaze entirely south, implementing the Southern strategy.
Their calculus in the South was based on three key assumptions, right?
Yes. First, that the Southern colonies contained a large Loyalist population ready to rally to the king. Second, that the vast geography would make it difficult for Washington to project power there.
And third,
the cynical hope of recruiting slaves by promising freedom, which would also cripple the Southern Patriot War effort.
And they saw initial successes. They captured Savannah in 1778 and Charleston in 1780.
And they secured a decisive victory at Camden, giving them control of Georgia and South Carolina. But securing the territory proved impossible.
Why did their strategy fail?
Because they could not transition military control into political stability. The Loyalist support they expected just never materialized in sufficient numbers.
And the territory behind the British lines dissolved into chaotic, brutal guerrilla warfare.
Exactly. Militias led by men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, systematically negated British gains, forcing the British Army to chase shadows across the countryside. It was a nightmare for them.
And this pressure eventually led to the final decisive military action in 1781. General Cornwallis, worn down by the guerrilla resistance, marched his army to Yorktown, Virginia.
He was seeking resupply and expected evacuation by the British fleet.
But the French arrived first.
The French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, won the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake, denying the British Navy access to the bay,
which trapped Cornwallis entirely,
forcing the surrender of the Second British Army of the war to the combined forces of Washington and the French.
Yet, even after Yorktown, the war wasn't officially over. Washington didn't dare assume total victory.
No, Britain still maintained 26,000 troops in New York, Charleston, and Savannah.
And the American financial situation was so dire that Washington had to address the infamous Newburgh Conspiracy in 1783.
Right, where unpaid Continental Army officers, fearing they would be discharged without any compensation, were considering a military coup against Congress.
That's terrifying. How did Washington handle it?
He had to personally appeal to their patriotism, using his immense moral authority to calm the unrest. This desperate financial situation forced Congress to promise the officers a 5-year bonus for their service.
It just highlights how close the new republic came to being destroyed by its own internal financial collapse, even after the battlefield victory.
Absolutely. Which brings us to the nature of the American victory, which remains a key point of historical contention.
You have historian John E. Furling, who famously called the American success almost a miracle.
Right, emphasizing the difficult odds faced by this decentralized, unpaid army against the world superpower.
But you have to balance that with the argument from Joseph Ellis.
Ellis argues the odds actually favor the Americans long term, thanks to that demographic reality Franklin noted.
But he says the British missed their single true opportunity to win the war, which was in the summer of 1776.
Exactly. Ellis attributes this failure to the flawed tactical decisions of the Howe brothers, who hesitated after the Battle of Brooklyn, allowing Washington's army to escape.
Which effectively prolonged the war until France could intervene and change the entire game.
That's the argument.
So as John Adams famously claimed years later, the real war was won long before the battles. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people.
And the physical conflict was merely the culmination of a profound ideological shift rooted in Enlightenment thought.
We need to spend some time differentiating the two dominant philosophies at play here, because they often conflicted with each other.
Yes. First, you have liberalism, which was heavily influenced by John Locke's two treatises of government.
And this philosophy focused on the individual.
Completely. It emphasized natural rights, equality by creation, and the fundamental requirement for government legitimacy to rest on the consent of the governed. This provided the rhetoric for throwing off the monarchy.
Okay, so that's liberalism. Then you have republicanism,
which was inspired by the Whig Party's critique of the perceived corruption in the British government. Republicanism focused not on the individual, but on the communal good.
It placed immense focus on civic virtue.
Precisely. It required men to subordinate their private, personal desires, their ambition, their greed to public duty, and the common good.
And that is a crucial tension because they are not the same thing at all. Liberalism says, my rights must be protected from government.
And republicanism says, I must sacrifice my self-interest for the good of the republic.
Adams saw this tension clearly, stressing that public virtue cannot exist without private, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics.
The founders truly believed that liberty could only survive if the citizens were virtuous enough not to abuse it.
We also have to acknowledge the vital role of religion in propagating this ideology.
The sources repeatedly point to Protestant dissenters, specifically Congregationalists, Baptists, and Presbyterians, who acted as a school of democracy.
While most Church of England clergymen preached loyalty to the king,
these dissenting preachers openly espoused revolutionary themes, having long resisted the established Anglican hierarchy.
And the Declaration itself explicitly grounds its claims in this religious framework, referring to the laws of nature and of nature's God.
Furthermore, the rise of evangelicalism played a subtler but powerful role. By emphasizing moral behavior and individual piety over traditional class status, evangelicalism inherently challenged the established social and political hierarchy.
It reinforced the idea of egalitarianism, at least among white men.
Right. And this ideological crucible resulted in a deeply fractured society, forcing people to choose sides.
You had the Patriots, who comprised about 40–45% of the white population.
They were united by their extreme sensitivity to any appearance of tyranny, their commitment to republicanism, and a deep belief in local autonomy.
Then you had the Loyalists, or Tories. They were a smaller group, about 15–20% of the white population.
And they were generally older, better established, maintained strong ties to the Church of England, and were deeply connected to imperial business networks, particularly the merchants in port cities like New York.
And their central fear was that the revolution would collapse into anarchy or destructive mob rule.
Exactly. And we can't forget the largest group, often overlooked, the neutrals, who simply wanted the war to end so they could be left alone.
The most prominent neutral group being the Quakers, particularly in Pennsylvania, who advocated pacifism.
And they faced accusations of sedition because they attempted to continue trading with Britain after the war began, highlighting the zero-tolerance environment the Patriots imposed.
Stepping back, we also have to consider the perspective of King George III, who viewed this conflict not just as a political issue, but as a deeply personal one.
He genuinely believed he was defending the ancient British Constitution against usurpers. He saw any British leniency as a sign of dangerous weakness.
His determination was absolute. Even after the surrender at Saratoga, he refused to consider peace,
famously saying he was determined to keep the rebels harassed, anxious, and poor. He only finally accepted defeat and allowed peace negotiations to proceed when he lost political control of Parliament after the Yorktown surrender.
Now let's turn to the vast majority of the population who were not soldiers. Let's start with women, who were absolutely integral to the success of the cause.
Before the war, they served as the primary enforcement mechanism for the non-importation movement.
Because they were the primary consumers of household goods, their commitment to the boycotts was crucial. They actively rejected British tea and returned to domestic manufacturing.
Spinning and weaving their own cloth, the Daughters of Liberty. The sources cite that the women of Boston alone produced an astonishing 40,000 skeins of yarn in 1769, a massive public display of patriotic commitment.
And during the war,
they became the essential civilian infrastructure. They maintained farms and businesses, acted as camp followers, nurses, cooks, laundresses for the army, and some were even spies.
And following the revolution, women like Abigail Adams began to test the limits of these new ideals, imploring her husband to remember the ladies when framing the new laws.
Lest women start their own revolution, she said.
Yet, the legal system remained brutally resistant to extending this new locking liberty to women.
And this is where we need to explain the legal concept of coverture. It's critical to understanding their status.
What was it?
Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was entirely subsumed by her husband's. She could not vote, hold political office, sue or be sued, sign contracts, or, critically, own property independently.
So any wages she earned or property she inherited legally belonged to her husband.
Correct. The revolutionary philosophy applied to women's rights was therefore fundamentally different from that applied to men. Men were given the Lockean ideal of individual autonomy and liberty.
While women were relegated to a philosophy emphasizing duty and obligation, confined to raising virtuous Republican sons and maintaining the domestic sphere.
And it was this stark contradiction, universal rights for men juxtaposed against the legal cage of coverture for women, that later fueled the first true pioneers of women's rights, like Mary Wollstonecraft.
The success of the revolution was also deeply reliant on foreign and diverse domestic forces. We often forget how much of the victory was bought with French money and muscle.
France began providing major financial aid and munitions starting in 1776, culminating in the formal military alliance of 1778.
That financial aid was so massive it led to France's own national bankruptcy.
Which was a direct catalyst for their revolution a decade later. Spain, though wary of American republicanism, declared war on Britain in 1779, capturing Florida and ensuring crucial supply lines remained open.
This conflict was truly global and multinational. The British hired tens of thousands of auxiliary German troops, the Hessians.
Yet the American cause benefited immensely from figures like Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the former Prussian officer who joined Washington at Valley Forge.
His contribution was transformative.
It was. He professionalized the Continental Army, introducing standardized drill, formations, and discipline. He took a chaotic collection of state militias and turned them into a professional fighting force.
Turning to the non-white participants, the sources highlight that most Native American tribes distrusted the expansionist Americans and sided with the British, hoping to halt settler expansion.
A key figure here was Joseph Brant, or Tainenadija, of the Mohawk Nation. He led devastating raids against settlements, making him a terror to the colonists.
And this decision proved tragic for the indigenous population.
It did. As historian Colin Calloway concluded, the war was one of the darkest periods for indigenous people due to burned villages and crops, divided councils, and betrayal.
The British, in the 1783 peace treaty, ceded native lands to the U.S. without any consultation whatsoever,
paving the way for further expansion and conflict.
Finally, we have to confront the revolution's deepest, most profound paradox: Black Americans and the institution of slavery.
Samuel Johnson's question: how is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of the Negroes? It just encapsulates the staggering hypocrisy.
And yet, Crispus Attucks, killed in the Boston Massacre, is honored as the first casualty for independence, a free black man.
Free blacks, particularly in the North, served honorably for the Patriots. Nearly 9,000 veterans served. But the war offered a direct path to freedom for the enslaved who joined the British side.
Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775 and the Philipsburg Proclamation in 1779 explicitly promised freedom to any enslaved person who enlisted with the British forces.
This transformed the conflict into a literal race war in the South. Tens of thousands of slaves escaped to British lines. South Carolina alone lost about 1/3 of its entire enslaved population.
Southern patriots viewed this British tactic not just as military strategy, but as a deliberate plot to overturn the racial hierarchy, which just fueled their intense support for independence.
Post-war, the pressure of these revolutionary ideals did spur some action. Northern states, where slavery was less economically entrenched, passed gradual abolition laws by 1804.
And in the upper South states like Virginia and Maryland, the free black population increased significantly.
From less than 1% to nearly 10% between 1790 and 1810, driven by individual manumissions, where enslavers, citing revolutionary ideals, chose to free their slaves. But the institution remained intact and protected in the Deep South, ensuring future conflict.
So the conclusion of hostilities came with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and the sources reveal a surprising twist. The American negotiators, Franklin, Adams, and Jay, had to secretly negotiate directly with Britain, bypassing their French allies.
The Americans discovered that France, while essential for the victory, opposed major U.S. territorial gains. France wanted the U.S. to be a weak, dependent client state contained east of the Appalachians.
With the vast Western territory reverting to Spanish control or becoming an indigenous buffer zone.
So the Americans immediately cut the French out and opened direct, secret talks with Britain.
And Britain's Prime Minister Shelburne made an extraordinary calculation. He saw the colonies were lost, but he recognized a massive opportunity.
To make the U.S. an economically valuable trading partner, free from the burdens of defending or governing them.
And the results for the U.S. were extraordinary. The peace treaty granted the new nation all land east of the Mississippi River, south of the Great Lakes. It effectively doubled the size of the country.
They secured crucial fishing rights off Canada, and the British blockade was immediately lifted. The sheer generosity of the land grant shocked Britain's European rivals.
But the American victory came at a staggering financial cost, which nearly destroyed the Republic in its infancy. We need to pause and contrast the two financial systems involved.
The British war effort cost $100 million, but it was sustained and paid for through a sophisticated centralized system of banks, financiers, and established public credit.
While the American financial system under the Continental Congress, by contrast, was pure chaos.
It had no strong central fiscal authority and relied almost entirely on state contributions and printing unsecured paper money.
And that paper money became instantly infamous. Congress issued $242 million in continental dollars, leading to hyperinflation so severe that not worth a continental became synonymous with worthlessness.
The numbers are just mind-boggling. By 1779, one Spanish silver dollar was worth 40 continental dollars. By 1781, it was worth 167.
And this inflation brutally burdened the Continental Army soldiers. Their wages were already delayed, and the money they were paid was dramatically declining in value every month.
This is the direct cause of the desperation that led to the Newburgh Conspiracy. These soldiers felt betrayed, paid in worthless paper after years of sacrifice.
The turning point for American finance during the war was the appointment of Robert Morris as Superintendent of Finance in 1781.
Morris was the essential first step toward solvency. He used a French loan to establish the Private Bank of North America, introduced competitive bidding for military contracts, and demanded stricter accounting procedures.
Despite Morris's late intervention, the U.S. struggled immensely to pay its foreign debts post-war. They actually defaulted on interest payments to France in 1785.
And critically, the national government under the Articles of Confederation had no power to compel the states to pay their shared war debts, which totaled $80 million.
This combination of financial weakness and governmental impotence led directly to civil unrest that proved the system was unsustainable.
Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786, an armed uprising of indebted farmers protesting foreclosures and high state taxes, was the crucial catalyst.
Nationalists like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton used this event as proof that the decentralized system of the Articles of Confederation was failing,
which convinced Congress to call the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 with the stated goal of merely amending the Articles.
The result, of course, was an entirely new framework, the U.S. Constitution, which created a much stronger federal republic designed with checks and balances to prevent both the tyranny of the monarchy and the anarchy of excessive democracy.
And the financial health of this new federal government was secured by the first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. In 1790, he implemented his brilliant, revolutionary financial plan.
He proposed that the federal government assume all the state war debts, combining them with the national debt into a single massive $80 million national obligation.
And here's the genius and the political fight.
Yeah.
He insisted on paying that entire debt, including the depreciated continental dollars, at full face value.
Why was this so important?
It wasn't about rewarding the original soldiers. It was about instantly establishing national honor and credit in the eyes of European financiers. It made the United States the most credit-worthy country in the Atlantic world overnight.
The Constitution was ratified in 1788, and to assure those who feared strong federal power, the Anti-Federalists James Madison spearheaded the addition of the first 10 amendments.
The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, assuring inalienable rights and cementing the foundations of the new republic.
So the American Revolution's influence was immediate and profound. It was the first of the great Atlantic revolutions, truly the shot heard round the world, establishing the first modern constitutional republic and signaling the definitive transition from an age dominated by monarchy to one seeking freedom and self-governance.
The list of subsequent movements directly inspired by the U.S. model is extensive.
The French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Latin American independence movements. They all attempted to replicate the overthrow of inherited colonial rule.
The legal and structural influence was pervasive. The U.S. Constitution remains the world's oldest surviving written constitution.
And the Declaration of Independence directly influenced France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789. The sources even note that in Ireland, the American example provided leverage for the Protestant minority to force significant concessions from the king.
It highlighted that the monarchy no longer had a monopoly on lethal force or political authority after the American success.
But historians continue to vigorously debate the depth of the revolution's radicalism. Scholars like Gordon Wood and Edmund Morgan argue it was profoundly unique and radical.
How so? They say it successfully destroyed aristocracy as a social and political force, as it had been understood in the Western world, generating a powerful, egalitarian view of human society where, at least theoretically, all men were equal.
Leopold von Ranke, the influential German historian, claimed the revolution introduced a new, crucial force into the world stage.
He argued that it fundamentally reversed the long-standing principle that political power should flow from the king down to the people, installing the idea that power should originate from the people up, a principle that inspired nearly every revolutionary movement that followed.
However, we have to consider the counterpoint often raised by historians like John Murren.
While the ideas were sweeping, the initial reality was limited. The people, granted these rights and power, were initially restricted almost entirely to free, white, property-owning men.
The revolution was radical in its ideas, but conservative in its immediate social application.
And this brings us back to the stark contradiction between liberty and slavery. Historian Christopher L. Brown argued that slavery had never been on the agenda in a serious way before, meaning it wasn't a major topic of public debate prior to 1776.
But the revolution's ideals forced it to become a public question from that point forward.
And though northern states moved toward abolition, the failure of the South to follow immediately set the fundamental division that would define the next 8 decades of American history.
The ideological fervor also successfully fueled the struggle for women's rights. Despite the heavy legal limitations imposed by coverture, the core revolutionary ideas directly inspired women like Mary Wollstonecraft,
who published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, pioneering the enduring discussion of equal rights, education, and autonomy.
Today, the legacy remains central to American memory, memorialized by holidays like Independence Day and Washington's birthday.
The National Park Service and private trusts protect over 100 battlefield and historic sites, ensuring that the documents and artifacts like the detailed 1777 Return of Ordnance Stores manuscript remain available for continued study.
Reminding us how close to failure the entire enterprise really came.
So to synthesize this deep dive for you, the American Revolution was a whirlwind of political, financial, and military uncertainty. It was successfully driven by the collision of evolving British policy, catastrophic financial crises, and immense ideological fervor drawn from both Locke-in natural rights and stern civic republicanism.
It successfully transitioned a population already accustomed to governing themselves into citizens of a new, complex, and sometimes contradictory federal republic, which was dependent on outside forces and brilliant post-war financial planning.
It's a powerful story of how ideas can shatter an empire. The fusion of Enlightenment philosophy and the school of democracy from religious dissenters proved potent enough to launch the first modern constitutional republic.
But that fusion immediately highlighted the profound, unaddressed gap between the espoused ideals, equality for all men, and the historical reality of slavery and gender limitations enforced by laws like coverture.
So we leave you with this final thought to ponder. If the revolution's success was heavily dependent on French military intervention, Spanish supply lines, and Hamilton's complex financial gymnastics after the fact,
And yet it established the most influential model for modern democratic governance.
did its revolutionary legacy stem more from the practical, fragile structure it built to survive the crisis, or the universal sweeping ideas it proclaimed to the world?
Something to chew on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the American Revolution.